Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's your boy, Delightful Kiss Boy, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects of all time, which is horror. For those who don't know, I'm a huge horror fan. I love all sorts of horror media, like movies, games, stories. I read a lot of horror short stories. But today I want to specifically focus on one aspect of horror that I find interesting. Because it's kind of confusing and almost seems paradoxical. And that's the fact that a lot of horror media becomes cozy. All right? Now, for people who aren't hardcore horror fans, they might seem like a strange thing to say, right? Because oftentimes people find them to be unpleasant or scary, right? Because that's what oftentimes is the aim of horror media. But I think that there are going to be a lot of people watching this who have seen a lot of horror media, specifically horror gameplay, and from horror games, and are going to know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? So let's get into it, okay? The first thing I want to talk about, though, is just what is coziness? Like, what comes to mind when you think of the word cozy, which is a word I'm going to be repeating a lot throughout this video, let me just tell you. Well, the thing that comes to mind for me, because I'm a big fan of Christmas, is like Christmas Eve night, you're sitting there, it's snowing outside, it's cold, the weather outside is frightful, and it's like nighttime, and you got a roaring fire going. You're sitting there, with a blanket and maybe like a sweater on or something, and you have some hot cocoa with you, and maybe you're watching like TV, and you're just relaxing, and you're sitting. You see right outside the window, there's all this snow coming down, and it's kind of that contrast between you're all snug as a bug inside with this fire, and outside it's kind of like it's cold and maybe stormy or windy or snowy, right? But you're all warm and cozy inside, On top of that, it could be like maybe there's one other person around, like your significant other or something like that. But usually there aren't very many people around, and it's usually very quiet, right? So maybe you have a little bit of ambient noise going on, like a crackling fire or maybe running water or something like that, or the sound of raindrops or whatever, But it's very quiet, and it's secluded. You kind of have that seclusion aspect of it, being alone, solitude, right? It's kind of the word that I'm looking for there. So that's what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of cozy. In addition to that, I can maybe think of something like a cabin out in the woods. Once again, there's that solitude factor, maybe you have like propane lamps, these kind of like yellow, slightly dim lights, and you're smelling that propane, and you're inside, you're warm, and it's darker outside or whatever. People can think of that. People can also think of cutesy things. Like you can think of a game like Animal Crossing as being a cozy game, Oftentimes because you're going to be playing it in a cozy setting, it's a very kind of wholesome, relaxing game. There's not a lot of like stimulus in the game, and you're kind of just going around, beautifying things, etc. Right? So those are kind of the things that I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of things that are cozy. But I'm mostly going to talk about that element of like solitude and peace and quiet. All right, because I don't know about you guys, so I love the early hours of the morning and the late hours of the night, all right? I'm kind of a night owl. I love it when there aren't a lot of people awake, and I get that feeling of solitude. I've always loved it since college, all right? I would spend, I'd have late nights in the computer lab, working on my projects. There'd be nobody around to bother me, and I'm just doing my thing, and then I'm walking home, and it's dark out, and there's barely anybody out and about, and it's just very peaceful and quiet, and it's a great time for me in particular. And a lot of my friends like the same thing, so oftentimes me and one of my good buds would go on these late night walks. It'd be kind of the same sort of thing. Wouldn't be a whole lot of people out, it'd just be me and one other person there's kind of this seclusion, the solitude aspect. And oftentimes we go to destinations like, convenience stores to grab like an energy drink or something like that. And there's, usually just the employee manning the cash register and things like that, right? And not a whole lot of people around. And so that kind of is an extension of that kind of coziness, right? It's not quite as cozy as being, inside at night, but it's the same kind of thing. It's like that solitude aspect. And there's a lot of games that kind of tap into that feeling for me, right? And even though they're horror games, I get into this feeling of being in a cozy setting, right? Especially if I'm watching somebody else play the game, which is something that I do a lot of the time, because it's like I can just get into bed and I can put on like a manly badass hero video of him playing a horror game, right? And I'm going to watch that before I go to bed. And so there's kind of like the game itself can have these cozy aspects because there are plenty of creators that are doing this kind of slice of life style horror that I find really compelling. So a good example of that is there's an indie developer, Japanese indie developer that goes by the name Chillizart, who makes a variety of games, of horror games, that a lot of them are kind of the slice of life style, right? So one of them was called like the Convenience Store or some shit like that, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You're going to a convenience store. I'm trying to remember, do you work? I think you work at the convenience store. Yeah, but then spooky shit. Yeah, you work at the convenience store, spooky shit starts happening, and it takes off from there, right? But it's the same kind of thing. You're working the night shift at a convenience store. There's plenty of these games out there where you're working a night shift at some kind of a business, or you're at an office building at night. There's nobody else around, right? Chillizart also did one where you're working at a Starbucks either really early in the morning or really late at night. I don't know. It's basically Starbucks. You're like a barista, making drinks for people and shit like that. But it's like night out, right? And so these kind of settings kind of lend themselves to horror scenarios, right? I was mentioning Solitude earlier. It's the fact is that like horror games work best when there aren't a lot of people around, right? It's this eerie setting where you're alone, and you're having to, kind of navigate some kind of a setting with some sort of threat looming, right? So spooky shit starts happening. Maybe you have a jump scare every once in a while, whatever, right? But the fact of the matter is that the concept itself of kind of working late at night, to me, is a cozy vibe. So I kind of get this like dual enjoyment out of the media, right? There's the horror aspect. I love horror for a variety of reasons. I think it's, just interesting and fun, and it can be thrilling, and oftentimes like horror and weird ideas go hand in hand, right? So I love that aspect of it, but I also just love the setting and the vibe because it's reminding me of those good times that I had in college, hanging out with my buds, walking around late at night. It reminds me of those cozy nights inside, when it's snowing outside or something, and just having that peaceful time alone by yourself, And so it's tapping into both of these things at once. On top of that, I mentioned that I watch a lot of the gameplay for these video games at night as kind of a going to bed style ritual, almost, where it's like, okay, now I'm associating the gameplay of watching the gameplay of the cozy-ish game at night when I'm snug as a bug in my bed. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a trifecta kind of a thing going on, And that just amplifies my enjoyment even more, And the coziness factor. And so I think that like a lot of people would probably say that they have this same type of experience with horror media. It's like, when is the best time to watch a horror gameplay? Well, it's at night. What are you usually doing at night? Well, you're about to go to bed. You know what I mean? And so you get this association. On top of that, watching horror movies, when is the time that you're most likely going to be watching horror movies? For me, all the time. But for the average person, it's going to be like October, right? It's going to be around Halloween time, and that's when you're in the fall, which is probably, in my opinion, it's my favorite season, okay? And it's because it's like pretty cool outside, the leaves are turning red, you know? I think that fall is the coziest season, even over winter. Okay, winter has its own thing going on, but I just think that those fall vibes are just awesome. You know, it's a little bit chilly outside, it's really pretty outside. You're going to be staying inside more, or you're going to be wearing sweatshirts or sweaters outside because it's a little bit chilly, you know? And on top of that, you got Halloween, which is when you watch all your horror movies, and you're going to be staying up late with your friends, getting spooked, you know? And so that, I think, inherently is kind of has a certain coziness to it. It's like staying up late with your friends that's going to invoke this kind of, these positive memories, these nostalgic kind of memories. And that's another aspect of these horror games that I want to mention, which is kind of this nostalgia aspect of it too. Because when you think back on a nostalgic thing from your childhood, I think that in of itself kind of carries a certain coziness to it, because you're looking back on these events with kind of rose-tinted glasses, and you're remembering the best parts of it, and how in childhood things may have been more simple, you know? And I think that there's, you know, like I said, kind of a coziness that comes with that. But a lot of the games now, a lot of horror settings, not necessarily even horror settings, but it's kind of horror adjacent, because there are horror games that tap into the same kind of thing, which is kind of this liminal space phenomenon that's been going on for quite a while now. It's the same thing with like, there's some amount of it with like analog horror as well, okay? But basically it's kind of this throwback sort of a thing. Like, I'm trying to think of like the best way to describe liminal spaces. I mean, you probably know what I'm talking about. I'll pop an image of a typical liminal space up so you can see what I'm talking about. But basically, the initial idea behind liminal spaces was that it's just like, it's like an area that's meant to be passed through, right? So it's going to be, if you're in a mall or something like that, it would be an area where there's a lot of like foot traffic, right? Where you're not supposed to like linger around and stand around, and there's supposed to be a lot of people around you, right? But then it was kind of drawing attention to the fact that when there's nobody there and you're standing around in these areas, you get this eerie feeling like you're not supposed to be there, right? And that was the initial idea behind liminal spaces, and they kind of evolved into something all their own over time. The definition of the word, of the phrase liminal space, has a completely different meaning now, which has more to do with nostalgia, I would say. Nostalgia and dreamlike, kind of a dreamlike quality to it, than it does with the original definition, right? And so you'll see things like ball pits that are empty or something, or I don't know, the big thing is like pools, right? So it'll be these big kind of mega structures made out of like pools and pool slides and shit. It's kind of like a throwback to what you would experience in like childhood and this nostalgic aspect of it, right? So these kind of images and these kind of games that utilize this vibe aren't necessarily always explicitly horror, but there's a kind of inherent eeriness that's like carried through into them from the initial definition of it, where you have this eerie feeling when you're standing around in these areas. But it's like, it's also, in a certain way, as I said earlier, kind of cozy. You know, usually if you're playing a game that it utilizes these settings, it's very quiet, it's very secluded, and it's very nostalgic. And all of those together make a cozy vibe, you know? It's been used in, I don't know, there's a few games where you're wandering, there's a lot of games actually where you're wandering around liminal settings. There's tons of Backrooms games. Backrooms is a liminal horror sort of a thing, you know, where there's these big, you know, long hallways, there's these kind of flickering lights, there's this yellow wallpaper. It feels like a place that you know and that you've been, but you can't put your finger on when you were there, you know, that sort of a thing. But I think it's all part of the same sort of feeling, right? And so these kind of settings have been more and more prevalent in these different games. There's a game like that I want to play on this channel, by the way. I've seen some gameplay of it. Voices the Void, you know, that there's, you're kind of in this base and you're searching for signals out in outer space, you know, but oftentimes you're doing it at night, you know, and spooky shit starts happening, but you're kind of doing a job at night. It's kind of got a liminal feel to it in certain aspects. I guess not necessarily liminal, but it has that seclusion aspect. I just jumped to Voices of the Void because I was thinking about it. But there's tons of games that tap into those feelings, and I think it really lends itself well to the cozy feelings. You know, it's like there's a lot of like ironic overlap between this kind of solitude, nostalgic vibe, and horror, you know, that does really well, because a lot of these, you know, horror games will oftentimes also tap into, like, I mean, if you think about it, when were you most scared of, like, the dark? It was probably when you were a kid. So oftentimes these horror, you know, games, horror movies try to tap into that same kind of primal fear that you had as a child, you know? And so once again, having kind of nostalgic settings or nostalgic qualities to these movies or whatever kind of lend themselves to accomplishing that. It's putting you back in a time period where you were more likely to be scared. You know, it's taking you back. And I don't know, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing how all of these ideas kind of get muddled in your head. And I think the reason, too, why this sort of a thing comes to people who have been in the genre for a long time, you know, who are hardcore horror fans, is that, like, after a while, it stops being, like, scary, really. I mean, you still get, like, startled and stuff like that, but you're kind of watching it and you enjoy it, you know, and you're appreciating it and you love a good scare, you know, and you're kind of observing it, but you're not really intrinsically scared all that often, you know. You're kind of more of an appreciator, a connoisseur, right? And so you're kind of jaded to it. It's not really, like, startling as much as it would. So then those other qualities of the media start to come out and you start to appreciate those more. And I think that that's also why there's been this kind of renaissance within horror movies where the horror movies that are kind of coming out have more of a message to them, kind of more of a deeper meaning behind what's going on. A lot of times they're metaphors, that sort of a thing. And it's because I think that there's a horror audience out there that loves horror, that's seen everything. And so just having a straight up, like, scary movie isn't necessarily going to do it for them anymore, because it just isn't as scary as it used to be, you know? If you go back and watch those slasher movies from, like, the 80s, you know, they're not going to do the same thing nowadays as they would back then. In fact, if I watch them at all now, I think they're pretty boring, right? And so these newer creators understand that there are these hardcore horror fans that want something else. And what they want is they want horror themes, they want horror, you know, effects and story beats and, you know, elements of horror, but they want something else in addition to that. And I think that this kind of coziness aspect of it lends itself really well, especially to games, as I said, you know, slice of life kind of shit. There's also, I mean, there are explicitly games that kind of do this, juxtaposition between something that's very innocent and cutesy and something that's horrific. There's tons of games like that. I'm not usually as big of a fan of that. I mean, the whole mascot horror kind of genre is kind of tangential to that, you know. I mean, obviously, like something like Five Nights at Freddy's or whatever is tapping into kind of how creepy animatronics are at, like, Chuck E. Cheese, right? So that's a little bit different, but I don't know, like a Poppy's Playtime or whatever. I don't fucking know. I didn't really watch that shit, but I don't know. It's tapping into this kind of innocence and then using it as a juxtaposition for horrific things that are going on, right? And it can be effective for certain people. It's just usually not my go-to genre. Not a big fan of the mascot horror stuff. I'm more into those secluded, you know, realistic kind of settings where horror starts to happen, you know? But anyway, I think that's about where I want to end it here. Oh yeah, I was just going to say too, I mentioned dreamlike qualities. I want to go back to this kind of liminal spaces. I mentioned dreamlike qualities. I think that also is just kind of a cozy thing as well, you know. You're associating these settings, these vibes with dreams, which is when you're going to be sleeping, you know. Once again, a lot of people remember dreams from when they were kids. It's going to be all part of the same sort of thing. I mean, a good example of a game that has that really dreamlike quality, but it's also unsettling is a game like Yume Nikki. I mentioned it earlier, you know, where you're kind of wandering literally through these different dreams, and they're kind of bizarre and unsettling and like very sparsely populated. You know, there's a few monsters or things you can interact with, but for the most part, it's just you out there. I don't know. It's interesting. So, like I said, kind of TLDR. I think that that horror creators are realizing that you know, horror media needs to have things outside of the horror that fans can appreciate. You know, it's not just enough to have like a walking simulator with jump scares anymore. You know, there's an audience that loves the horror aesthetic, but and the you know, the themes and stuff like that, but they want things on top of that, you know. And there's a variety of different things that you can deliver on that. Like there are people who enjoy the more gamey aspects of these sort of games, you know. So they'll have kind of I don't know, stress-based mechanics. A lot of people dig that kind of thing, where you're kind of running around and hiding and playing kind of a hide-and-seek game, and you're getting kind of this thrill out of it. But on top of that, you can go the opposite direction, which is kind of creating a vibe that people enjoy being in, and then using that as the setting for the horror, and it kind of serves two purposes. It's like a juxtaposition between a cozy setting and a horrific thing that's going on, but it's also just like an enjoyable setting at the same time. So that's really all I want to talk about. I really want any excuse to talk about horror, but let me know what you guys think. Do you feel the same way? Am I crazy up here talking about how, you know, cozy horror is? I couldn't tell you, honestly. I mean, I think that I've seen online people talk about that in like comments and things like that, but most of my friends don't like horror, at least on the level that I do, and so if I mention it to them, they have no idea what the fuck I'm going on about, but there you go. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed listening to me yap. I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.